All right, I think we can get started. Hello, everybody. Charlie Zilli, if you don't know me, Chair. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole of the Metropolitan Council. Okay, spoiler alert, we're still in a pandemic, and this is a virtual meeting, and it is due to not the governor declaring a state of emergency, because that is over, but it has been my determination that it is still prudent. So we're holding this virtual meeting under Minnesota statute section 13D.021. We have been unable to take public comment, but we are going to start taking public comments at our full council meetings, which will be in a week. And those members of the public that would like to pre-register to make some comments can. Also, just to make general comments to public.info@metc.state.mn.us. And we'll get back to your comments. And if you'd like to make a 3-minute comment next full council meeting, we can start that next week. In the meantime, we're going to start a roll call and establish our quorum for this committee meeting. Bridget, is that you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
All right, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Barber.
Here.
Chambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Ferguson.
Here.
Gonzalez. Gonzalez. Johnson. Johnson. Lee.
See Councilmember Johnson nodding.
Okay, thank you. Lee.
Here.
Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom.
Here.
Lindstrom.
Here.
Muse. Muse. Sterner.
Here.
Bento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Zarin.
Present.
Chair Zelli.
I'm here. Great. We have a quorum. And I think everybody's seen the agenda. I will say for a committee of the whole, we have a number of different presentations, so it's a packed agenda. I really will try to keep this out of respect for everybody's time under our 6 o'clock time limit, or 2 hours. And if we do not have enough time, I've been told from community development that the land use inventory can be addressed at a future meeting. So we're going to see what we can do about addressing all the agenda items. But if we don't, we're not going to feel badly about it, because we want to make sure we allow enough time to ensure we address these important issues. So if there's no disagreement, I'm going to assume that the agenda is approved, which brings us to the minutes from July 7th, 2021. Which were sent in advance. Is there a motion and a second to approve the minutes from our last committee of the whole meeting?
So moved.
Second by Lee.
Thank you. Any discussion? If not, Bridget, you may call the roll.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Barber.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Ferguson.
Aye.
Gonzalez. Gonzalez. Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Muse. Muse. Sterner.
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Zarin,
Aye.
Terzelli.
Aye. The minutes are approved. So great. Thanks, everybody. I think that this next item, information item, which is something I think all of us have been looking forward to, and a great relationship we've had with the Citizens League during these many months. And I also really want to shout out the work of the staff, especially Michelle Furry, who's been deeply involved in this work. And just to kind of review, we've been really working on engaging the public and stakeholders on just kind of all aspects about safety on our transit system, and even to the point of talking about or getting a greater understanding about the definition of safety and a kind of a higher level understanding of community and customer concerns about what that safety is, including, interactions with our Metro Transit police. Clearly, this comes after a period of time following the murder of George Floyd, civil unrest, and deep questioning about the role of policing in our many jurisdictions, not the councils, just our our country and our city in particular. So, today we're going to have a chance to kind of look at the themes that come from their work. I have to say they're in the middle of this process, so this is not the final report, which they will be working on later. But I think we'll get a really good snapshot of all the work that they've been doing and their partners. We're going to get a full summary in very soon about this full report on their engagement and what they've learned. And just to, you all know this, but I mean, we talked about this last month. This is a really important step as we have almost monthly meetings talking about our approach toward public safety and the Metro Transit Police. We'll have a work study group that's working on it, help guiding it for our conversation. And we'll continue to be doing this until through the rest of the year, really into 2022. It's important that we're not waiting to make changes along the way. In fact, I think a lot of what we've been doing at Transit has really been based in part on some of the findings that we've gotten from the Citizens League efforts. And no mystery, this most recent announcement last month, bringing in community service officers who are non-uniformed presence is largely kind of developed in part from the feedback we've gotten from both Citizens League, from our frontline transit workers and others. So we're gonna have a chance for questions. I kind of ask that we kind of listen to their presentation and then ask more substantive conversation and discussion at the end. But if there is a clarifying question in the middle, I mean, don't be shy, raise your hand or get my attention or their attention. But a lot of what you might be interested in learning about might come later in the presentation. So let's wait for the substantive discussion. We'll leave plenty of time for that at the end. So with no further ado, really it's a great honor to introduce the team. I think you've met with, we've seen them before in front of the full council. But first, Amanda Kunja Bahari, who has really been leading this work and who has made reports to us in the past, and has been in charge of public affairs for the Citizens League, and Kate Samino, who is the executive director of Citizens League. And they're joined by Marika Pfefferkorn from the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance, who's been a key partner of the Citizens League in the work on this engagement. So I think we all know why we're here. I will pass it off to, I'm not quite sure who I'm passing it off to, maybe Kate or Amanda. Kate, okay, great. Welcome, and we're looking forward to this. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair Zelli, and hello, council members. It's good to see you, and hello, staff and guests that are also on the call today. Good to be with you. Thank you again for this opportunity to be with you here today and provide this preliminary, we'll call it, summary and update on this transit safety project. As Chair Zelli mentioned, my colleague Amanda Kunchbahari, our public policy director from the Citizens League, is here. Along with myself, I serve as executive director of the Citizens League. And of course, our partner on this project, Marika Pfefferkorn from Twin Cities Innovation Alliance, is also with us. You'll be hearing a lot from Amanda and Marika, but I'll just briefly kind of kick things off here. As you know, the aim of today's presentation is to share an update on this project. It's very nearly complete, and we want to be able to answer any questions you have at this point. I hope that you'll find that there's a lot of good material and good information that you'll be hearing today. But please know that outreach and one-on-one interviews in particular are still ongoing at this point. So please note that when you see numbers and data on community engagement in this upcoming presentation, those are in progress numbers. Those aren't quite yet final. Council members, I want to personally thank you for the opportunity that our team had to meet with many of you individually during the course of this project. It was really a pleasure to spend that time with you individually. Our team greatly appreciated and valued that time, so thank you again. And before we get started, I'll turn it over to Amanda momentarily here, but I would like to place this project in time and just remind us all of the time that we have been living in and that this project has been occurring within. We know it's been really a incredibly tumultuous year, particularly in the Twin Cities and the metro area where this work was really based. And this project predominantly has taken place during this past winter and spring, which was the 1-year mark of the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as Chair Zelli mentioned right at the outset, is not over. And we know that this pandemic deeply impacted transit users, their not only use of the system, but their perceptions of use of the system, both from a health and safety perspective, and then the unrest that started last summer and continued. So there have been just a lot of elements of that that have affected transit. You all know this is not new information, but just wanted to mention it. And beyond that, just that it's been a very strained time for community and police and public safety relations in our cities. And so Amanda will be sharing more about this context and how we perceive that this impacted the project, because this project we saw as kind of a snapshot of this particular moment in time. So thanks for the opportunity just to name that at the outset so that we're approaching this work with a shared understanding of when this is happening and in what context. So thank you again. And with that, I'll invite Amanda Kunchbahari to share more.
Right. Thank you, Kate. If I can get the PowerPoint slide deck up, that would be fantastic. And hello, council members, too. I can just get started. We can go to the next slide, please. It's good to be with you all tonight, as Kate mentioned, and Chair Zelli. My name is Amanda Kunchbahari. I serve as Director of Public Policy with the Citizens League, and really happy to be here to share some preliminary results with you all. Again, I'll continue to reiterate that this project is still ongoing, so we just want to make sure that folks know that, and we're excited to share with you the final report in September. So before I begin, I just want to remind folks again, and Chair Zelli beautifully stated this, our project scope was kind of twofold. First, we wanted to understand how riders, stakeholders, and community members define safety and understand the interactions and the subsequent impact that people have had on transit and with the transit police. So that's kind of, those two were kind of our main points of scope for this work. You met our project team, and we have folks listed there on the slide. And I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the work. So we led, and we're currently leading, 2 concurrent groups. The first one that I'll talk about is the Stakeholder Committee. Several folks from the council served on that, so thank you for your time and your work there. The role of that committee really was to serve as high-level advisors on strategy and guidance on our stakeholder engagement specifically. And you'll see we listed who was a part of that. We're really grateful for the folks that did serve on that. and for their insights and expertise as well. And with that group, they really did help to design some of our stakeholder conversation questions that we're using and made a lot of really wonderful recommendations as to who we should connect with. So currently with that work, we have kind of sunsetted that committee, and we are kind of in full gear of doing stakeholder engagement with an emphasis and focus on business chambers at this time. So I will not be sharing findings from that because we're still very early in that process and I've only had a few conversations, but please do look to the full report for those findings. And there are some themes that are coming out of those conversations that are similar to what you're going to hear tonight from the community forums and the surveys that we've conducted. So again, we will share those in the full report in September. And then I want to invite our colleague and partner in this work, Marika Peppercorn from Twin Cities Innovation Alliance, to talk to you a little more about the community group and what their role was, who was a part of it, and some of the work that they did as well.
Can you hear me? Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So again, an overview of, I'm sorry, I'm just reading the slide there. Okay, so I just wanted to share with you an overview of the community group a little more in depth. So if you'll go back to that slide that we were just on. Thank you. And so a couple pieces about the community group is, as Amanda mentioned, that these are all community members who use transit. They are representative and reflective of our ridership in and across the Twin Cities. In addition to that, they were compensated for their time. They helped shape and participated in the process. And also along the way, we're able to learn and understand more complexly how the Metropolitan Council operates. And as a part of that community group, we were able to tap into important engagement strategies to ensure that the ridership is accurately reflected in the findings of the work that we've been doing. So if you will, just change it to the next slide, please. So if you'll remember, when we first presented to you, we shared a timeline. We had started the project with the community committee in February. However, the exploratory phase of that happened in January. So we were looking for community organizations that could partner with us to help us tap into who would be able to support us on this committee. We did onboarding and orientation and community building. So this group of 8 to 10 individuals would be able to work together. And then we needed them to understand what really is the Metropolitan Council and Metro Transit, and what is their scope of work that we're actually talking about, to really be able to understand who and what we need to know as a community. So that really happened in our exploratory phase, January through February. We had 2 monthly meetings as a community committee. So as we continue to go across the calendar in March and April, we met twice a month. We worked on designing survey planning. So a part of that is learning on how to ask good questions, how to be inclusive in the questions that you're asking. And then also we talked about forums, knowing that institutions and entities offer a bunch of different ways to engage community in conversation. So we talked about what would be the best way to hear back from community members. And so in that forum planning, that's where we decided the format for the forums and using the World Cafe. And then in April, not only did we launch the survey live, we hosted a number of forums, March, April, and then launched those in May and June. So the delivery went live again in May. So all the surveys went public. We partnered with the Metropolitan Council team to make sure that we sent information out on the different servers, distribution lists and networks. We invited council members to share with their regional communities information about how they could attend a forum or they could provide input on a survey. And then we also use social media as a strategy to do outreach. To make sure that everyone across the Twin Cities really understood that this process was underway. In addition to online and outreach, we also did groundwork, which meant that we were out in the streets posting and sharing information live and in real time with passengers in light rail. And so to get them to understand that we valued their insight and input through the survey or through the forums. And so that really happened. We had our last forum in June, and the survey has been ongoing. And when we had our last forum in June, we did an assessment of where we were with our demographics, understanding that we want our results to reflect the ridership of Metro Transit. And so we said, we would use that survey and say who has not shown up in the responses in this portion of the survey. Because we had the surveys translated into 6 different languages to make sure it was accessible. So we learned that there were still communities that we were not reaching through that survey. We knew that was going to happen, and that's why we had the strategy of the one-on-one. And so we hired folks to go out and actually interact with passengers in real time, go out to the platforms, the stations, the buses, and the light rail, and then to interview them with the same survey that everyone else is taking, just knowing that we're targeting particular populations, both racially and in language, because those are some of the categories that were still low in our representation numbers. So we are still currently doing the survey live, and we are doing the one-on-ones, and we'll continue to do that to make sure that we have full representation of all of the demographics of the ridership over the course of the month of August. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Marika. I can jump in here. So Marika beautifully covered our different engagement strategies. 2 things I want to add though, with the surveys in particular. So Marika and the team and us at Citizens League, with our forces combined, we reached out to over 350 organizations to promote the surveys and to promote the virtual community forums. So I think that's just a really important data point to put out there, that we really did try to get the information out. And again, I want to thank the council members. We had one-to-one conversations with everyone, I believe, and asked you to promote that as well within your networks. So very grateful for your participation with that and getting your constituents to fill that out, attend the forums, and to just be engaged in this project. I also wanted to note that Marika's team also, just innovative-wise, which is in your name, use QR codes so that folks had easier access to be able to fill out the surveys. So just the technology pieces that were implemented in this process of outreach, I think is important to name as well. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about the virtual community forums, and then Marika is going to get into the survey, some of the results that we've had so far and some kind of major themes. Again, just to reiterate, we did share this information with many organizations within the Twin Cities and beyond in all the different districts that Met Council covers. We held 3 total. We finished our last one at the end of June of this year. Marika will also talk about some intentional youth engagement that happened through focus groups. So we'll leave that towards the end of the conversation, but I do want to mention that that did happen, and there was some really concerted effort around that. The community forums themselves were structured in a World Cafe style. If folks are familiar with that style, typically the way we held it virtually was we did some very intentional introductions and community building with the folks who attended. And then we had prompt questions, and we'll go through each of those in a little bit here. But we put folks into breakout groups, gave them a chance to talk to each other, and then come back as a larger community to share, digest, and build off of each other's comments. So there was some beautiful synergy that happened in those meetings and really, really good insight that we gathered from those conversations. And again, I'll share that out with you in a little bit. And in total, we had 66 folks register for all 3 of the forums, and a total of 25 people attended. We can go to the next slide, please. Here are some demographics about who attended, just to raise up a couple of things. So the majority of our attendees were between the age of 40 and 65 years old. As you can see, racially, a majority of folks identified as white, and most of the participants lived in Minneapolis. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for our first question that we asked, how do you define safety on transit? So you'll see on here, this is kind of a harvest that Marika's team put together. There are a lot of different things that came out during these conversations, but I want to highlight and lift up a few key things that are seeming to come up throughout the conversations we're having and in the surveys. I don't want to say they're themes yet because, again, we're not done with the data gathering and analyzing yet, so I want to be really clear about that. But these are some things that are being raised to pay attention to. So we heard a lot about there's a difference between perception of safety versus actual risk of safety. And what we're hearing is that the perception still is driving people's behavior as to whether or not they're going to use transit or feel comfortable using transit. I think the first quote that you see on your screen there, a public transit system is a well-funded public transit system. This is a theme that continues to come up, and you'll see it coming up in the other slides that I go through. But this is an example of what somebody's talking about here that, again, continues to come up in these conversations, is funding around environmental factors. So an example of that might be well-lit stations or platforms and things like that. And I'll give more examples as we continue talking in the presentation. And then another key thing, gender-based harassment came up quite a bit. And so specifically women or folks who identify as women reported that this was happening. And so it was something that we thought was important to raise up. The reliability and consistency of the bus itself also was something that was raised. So respondents talked about feeling less safe when a bus was late or it didn't show up, and not having that reliable transportation made folks feel less safe because it might be later at night when that's happening. Or in Minnesota, as we all know, we have some extreme cold conditions. And so physically, folks were not feeling safe when that was happening. And then another key thing that came up that we've heard in different spaces, respondents also mentioned that safety is about seeing people and community members using transit. So just literally having a number of people using transit, bus, light rail, etc., that contributes to feeling safer. Next slide, please. So this question, do you feel safe on Metro Transit? Why or why not? And by Metro Transit, we mean bus, light rail, etc. Again, this question and the responses really do build off of the last one, and I think you'll continue to see that with these questions. Here, folks, again, are calling out that seeing more people using transit makes them feel safer. Another theme that came up was that riders tend to feel safer on the bus versus light rail because they talk about being able to physically see the driver on a bus and interact with them led them to feeling more safe. And there were a few concerns that came up in different questions about the helplines and different systems that Met Council has in place for riders to call for safety. Just concerns about the timely response of that. Oftentimes folks are feeling less safe about utilizing some of those things. Next slide, please. So this question is, how is your sense of safety disrupted? What experiences have made you feel unsafe? So the biggest theme here, and again, this has come up in the surveys and in other avenues, is about COVID. And people are talking about it's changing their riding habits, and specifically questioning safety from a health standpoint. There is mention that comes up in a later slide about whether or not folks are wearing masks, is that enforced, and just not having clarity around that, and that leading to a sense of not feeling as safe from a health standpoint. I think the quote in the middle of this slide is really important to lift up as well. Metro Transit is the dumping ground for underfunded safety/net services. So several respondents reported seeing folks who are experiencing crisis and/or hardship on transit or near transit, and that they want to see people get the services and supports that they need, but they're not sure who is going to provide that or who should provide that. Next slide, please. And so this ties into people feeling almost helpless as to not knowing who to call for a timely and supportive response for somebody who may be experiencing a crisis. And I think one thing to note in these forums, we really did hear people wanting to be able to support their fellow community member, but again, not knowing how to do that and not knowing where to go to be able to support them. And again, I mentioned in a previous slide about safety being a well-funded transit system. That was something that came up. Again, this theme was really centered around environmental safety. So we heard a couple of times people talk about safety equaling the cleanliness of a space and how well kept a space was. So the platforms, the actual trains and buses, and etc. And then you'll see here too, respondents mentioned that police presence can be a deterrent for disruptive behavior, but it can also be unsettling because of the possibility of escalation. So this led to another theme that we saw where folks wanted to see some type of unarmed staff person or individual on bus and light rail that they could interact with, that was leading to more of a sense of safety. But I do want to highlight that we did not get into any details about who that would be and what their exact role would entail. So those are some of the themes and key things, or not themes, key things that are coming up and surfacing from the conversations that we had during the community forums and some things that we're hearing in the surveys. But I want to pass it now again to Marika to really walk us through some of the survey results and some of the key things that were emerging from that.
Thank you. If you'll turn to the next slide, please. So I'm going to share with you information about our surveys. Please keep in mind that this presentation is based on data that was collected by July 13th. So much of the one-on-one information for the surveys is not included in this data, which means it may not look as representative as it should. And so we're working on that. So the surveys that we have been collected, I just want to remind folks that they were provided in multiple languages, Karen, Hmong, Somali, and a few others. We've only had one person actually complete it in Somali and 10 folks completed in Spanish. This does not mean that Spanish-speaking people or Somali people did not complete the survey. They may not have completed it in their in Somali or English, but they did indicate their demographic in the demographic information that we collected. If you'll take to the next slide, please. All right, so want to give you a little sense of what we're talking about in the survey and what kind of responses we're getting. So the majority of people that completed this survey are a pretty diverse age range. We have about some that are unknown, not as many with the 14-year-olds to 19-year-olds. And so I'll talk a little later about the youth outreach that we've done that is separate from this survey data. Okay, so the majority of folks that did complete the survey were in their 20s. And then also we have other age demographics between the 40s and the 40 and 49 was the second highest, I think. I'm sorry, the 30s. So when you think about who those people are that are taking our riders and they're taking their bus, they're showing, they're using transportation for work. They're using transportation for social activities. And they are riding to school, whether it's college, university, or other types of learning activities. The majority of the people that completed this survey used transportation during rush hours, which means afternoon and morning lead times. And this is an interesting piece of data that 60%, 66% of the English survey takers, which can be a very broad demographic, but that responded to the survey in English, are traveling to Minneapolis. 90% of Spanish survey takers are traveling into Minneapolis. So just thinking about how the different demographics are using transportation, when they're using it, and how they're using it. If you'll take it to the next slide, please. So when we talk with folks on the survey, we didn't talk with them when they submitted their surveys, how they felt about being safe on Metro Transit. The folks that responded to our survey felt pretty strongly, between strongly agree and agree, almost to 225, in fact, really felt like they were safe. So both perceived safety and felt safe. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So just like in the forums, we wanted to get to the beneath the surface about what people really felt and understood that their experience or definition of safety. So basically, folks just wanted to be about their business, to go to and fro without being interacted with. So for me or for others, getting to and from where I need to go without getting killed or seriously injured by cars, police, etc. And then also taking in mind the impact that the ridership has on the climate. So a lot of folks just want to be able to start their ride and end their ride in the same frame of mind without being disturbed, without fear of or anxiety of being attacked, robbed, or otherwise. And so really what you're seeing here is their definition of safety really is about their physical safety and their property. If you go to the next slide, please. So let's look at some of the other factors when we surfaced conversations about safety. And so almost 50% between agree and strongly agree believe that smoking impacts their sense of safety. And when you dug deeper into those conversations or in the open-ended areas in the survey where they would comment, smoking included marijuana, tobacco, and whether it was vape or otherwise. And so they were clear about the different type of safety of smoking and how it impacted them. As also in the community forums, the cleanliness impacts their sense of safety. So there was mention of a few bullet holes, needles on the ground, really interrupting their sense of safety. And that the emergency call buttons increase their sense of safety, whether there is a response or not is something that came up also in our open-ended conversations. So they felt it was important to have these emergency call buttons, but they weren't always sure that that call button would lead to a quick response to their emergency. Almost 75% both agree and strongly agree that lighting needs to be increased in order for them to feel more safe. And then also, just as Amanda mentioned, that trains and buses being on time is critical for folks feeling safe. Especially, this comes up in the open-ended questions of folks when they're taking or riding the trains or the buses when there aren't other passengers around. All right, if you'll go to the next slide, please. All right, and so as we continue to think about how people interact with their concept of safety on the bus, many folks felt like their driver and the friendliness of their driver was critical about whether they felt like they could count on them or if they'd be available to support. So most felt like the friendliness of the bus driver was really important to their safety. Another piece that like almost everybody that responded said that behavior of other passengers affects their sense of safety. So not operators, but other people on the bus were the greatest concern around their sense of safety and impacted how they felt safe on the bus. And many said that safety concerns have impacted when and how they ride. One of the conversations that Amanda has brought up is people identified that this COVID experience, how they're responding to this is based on their COVID experience. Had they responded to this survey prior to COVID, their answers would have been very different. Around half strongly agreed that they felt safer when the police were present. About half have had direct experience with transit police, whether observing or interacting with. And that made them, about half of them, almost half of them, feel safer. If you'll go to the next slide. So this is where, you know, there is a breakdown on how people are experiencing transit police. And so 84% indicated that they have witnessed the transit police interacting with others. Almost 50% strongly or agreed that it made them feel safer, but just as much, 15, almost 30% strongly disagreed that it did not make them feel safer. So that showed up also in the open-ended questions about what did that mean? And some of the themes that came up were with the police officers was, again, their response time, if they showed up and if they escalated. Now, in the open-ended questions that they had around safety, things that could contribute to safety, the same theme surfaced as in the forums as in the survey. So the environmental factors, the cleanliness, the lights, the shelters. And then one of the themes that consistently came up in both the forums and the survey was the talk of unarmed ambassadors or some type of security presence, not showing up as requests for more presence of police, but specifically about unarmed security ambassadors. And so in those open-ended questions, they distinguished between security and ambassadors. Ambassadors were community members and security was paid staff. All right, if you'll take it to the next slide, please. So let's talk about young people and their experiences with safety in Metro Transit and their relationship with police in Metro Transit. So if you could click, there should be some other items on this, and just keep clicking. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. So youth engagement. One of the things that we were intentional about doing is the community committee that helped guide us through the process of community engagement. We had youth on that committee. And so we noted when we wanted to have a youth community forum and youth didn't show up to that, we knew that we needed to use other strategies. So youth were providing input from the beginning on how to do so. One of the steps that we took in making sure that we heard voice from youth ridership in Metro Transit is to reach out to the Minneapolis Public School District because of the partnership with Minneapolis Public Schools and Metro Transit. And unfortunately, when we did reach out to the transportation department, they were not amenable to actually providing a survey to all of the students in the Minneapolis Public Schools. So then what we ended up doing was reaching out to school building principals and school counselors to recruit and engage with students that we could then do focus groups with. We also did outreach to youth serving organizations. And so that both youth that are in out of school time programs or other employment programs, we could reach them knowing that they were accessing transit for programming. And so those are some of the strategies that we used. And because of that, we were able to host a focus group. And the focus group that we had 16 youth participants, and the focus group was made up of African identifying young people. So that means that they could be African immigrant, identify as from the continent of Africa, or African American. Those are the students that participated in the focus group on safety and Metro Transit Police, which included the survey questions. What we've also been doing to make sure that we hear voice from young people is that we're doing the one-on-one interviews. And so we do have our interviewers out on the platforms, trains, and buses, and reaching out to young people and asking them to complete the survey as well. Some of the highlight things that we heard from young people, those that did respond to the surveys and the focus group, is that they feel very targeted. That operators are hypersensitive to them being on the bus, that other passengers are hypersensitive to them being on the bus, and other young people. So their experience for young people on the bus has been like the feeling hyper surveilled. What I will say is early data that's coming out of the conversation is that youth do not actually distinguish between Minneapolis police and Metro Transit Police. And so when we tried to get more specific about situations that they had experienced on the bus, they didn't necessarily know how to distinguish between the two. So we're going to do a deeper dive into the data to look at what other information that might be telling us. If you will shift it to the next slide, please. And I will now pass it over to Michelle.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Michelle Fury, and I work for the Metropolitan Council in our communications and engagement team. And I'm just going to go over a handful of slides where concurrently with the community engagement, we did some more intensive engagement with our frontline transit employees to make sure that their points of view were also included in this process. We did this work at the end of June when we did some in-person things. We went to 8 different sites where we engaged a number of people in person. And we also did a survey of frontline employees that was closed. It was open up until about a week ago. So that it occurred between late June and late July. We were able to engage around 100 directly staff who showed up off shift at the end of their shifts as they were coming and going, to take on their routes or to begin their time at the on shift that day. And we spent a lot of time talking to people one-on-one. There was really strong participation, especially in a couple of locations. And demographically, we had nearly 40% of participants who identified as people of color, and nearly 21% who identified as women. Next slide, please. A handful of snapshots about the definition of safety from our employees from the survey. As you saw from the public engagement, we wanted to give you a sense of what people are thinking about this from an employee perspective as well. Doing their work without fear, being able to, as employees and riders, be able to travel safely on our buses and trains. The safety to employees is to provide a clean and crime-free environment for our staff and customers where they feel comfortable and secure. Next slide, please, Greg. And then a couple of other things. If people don't have to be afraid to be who they are safe. If people can exist in a space without experiencing harm, harassment, or violence, they are safe. Again, an environment free from violence or harassment, and not feeling like I might not make it home each night. These are among the things that our employees said in the survey. Next slide, please. So among the themes that came out of the engagement was that they really appreciated the prominent presence of police on our vehicles. And they noted that they would like to see a little bit more of that. One of the things that overwhelmingly our employees say is they really appreciate the work that the police officers are doing, and they recognize that our system is big and that the needs on our system are great. And so our officers can't be everywhere all of the time. And so it's often clear that they're that when they are available, it's wonderful, but they recognize that there are lots of things that police are being are directing their attention to on our system. They talked a little bit about availability and response time, and they also brought up the idea of others on the system to help with situations where an operator in particular might not be able to solve all the problems on the vehicles when they're actually operating the vehicles. So they said it would be really helpful to have some kind of security or staff with authority on the vehicles as well. The other thing that they noted is some demonstrable consequence for bad behavior on our transit system. Across the board, people were really interested in seeing at least more tangible enforcement of policies, rules, and expectations. And they also cited some concern about, if someone did receive a ticket or was, given some sort of penalty on a vehicle, that they weren't confident that the system would see that through. And since we don't prosecute those cases, it's hard for us to make sure that that happens. But that was something that they cited as a concern. As well as something that you heard from the community engagement, our employees really recognize the opportunity that we have here to offer help, assistance, and in a more human-centered response to people who might be experiencing some sort of crisis on our system or are otherwise experiencing homelessness or some need. And among that, those things that we can do to respond, they cited opportunities for better coordination among those agencies so that they would know how to help them as well, much like passengers also said they'd like to know how we can help people. They also noted that we have partners in local government as well that we could potentially coordinate with, both on a law enforcement level and as well as a service providing level. Next slide, please. Additional concerns from our frontline employees is the one about creating an unwelcome environment for passengers. They're very concerned that as people begin returning to the system post-pandemic, that they will choose other ways to get where they want to go. And we really want people to come back, especially as we're starting to ramp up, hopefully for some additional return to work. Employees do say that they feel unsafe. Operators spoke a lot about having to deal with too much on a vehicle, as I noted before, and would really like some help with that, which in some cases might be a police officer, might be a community service officer, something else. Maintenance and facilities employees also feel vulnerable when they're out on the system, especially late at night. We did hear from a couple of staff members who said that they've adjusted their practice so that they aren't out alone anymore, and that they go in teams when they're going out, especially late at night. Conditions that our employees are faced with, especially on light rail, really make the job difficult when they're dealing with either trash or broken or damaged equipment, or in some cases human waste that they're also being made to clean up. So they did talk about that and how they would really love to see some of these issues addressed. Employees, I think across the board, are anxious and concerned, but I think that there is some, a lot of our employees did say that they were hopeful that this conversation and the community engagement that was going on could actually, really bring to light some of these really important issues and make a difference. So there was optimism expressed among staff despite their concerns and anxieties. Next slide, please. Other things that they brought up are a little bit more environmental, a little bit, about a person who has to drive a large vehicle around town. They were curious about how we might plan differently around the availability of layover stops for restroom breaks and other breaks on their shifts. Across the board, people were really grateful for the barriers that have been installed on the vehicles. They provide a really good, break between the driver and some of the passengers. They did have some thoughts about how those could be improved, but they overwhelmingly thought they were helpful. There was some discussion about cameras, not only just on our vehicles, but on platforms. And particularly facility staff really appreciated that it felt like there were other eyes and ears on the system that were really watching out for what's happening. And then some of the other things, in community, where a sign might be placed or, other barriers to drivers being able to see, they were concerned about those things. And they just noted, and I, as a person who doesn't drive very often, but who also has driven in the community recently, it does feel like there is a lot less awareness of people on the road. And again, when you're operating a large vehicle, that can be pretty significant. And they also cited that, people weren't necessarily being super respectful of the transit only lanes that exist throughout busy corridors. So they cited those things as concerns that they'd really noticed an uptick in some of those things. Next slide, please. I believe that's all that I have. Obviously, I will be here for questions, but I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda at this point. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Just to reiterate, I think Kate really covered this well during the introduction, but just to kind of close us out with a reminder of the current moment, specifically the tension around community and public safety, law enforcement at this moment, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. We think both of those two things definitely impacted people's ability to respond, to participate in this, and just their answers in particular, just with all of the stress and some of that tension kind of coming to the surface. And then the virtual environment, we'd be remiss to not mention that most of our engagement is happening during a pandemic, and as vaccine efforts have been rolling out, but we have really tried to keep public health as a #1 factor in this engagement process. So really convening folks in a virtual environment and just some of the limitations of that. But as Marika mentioned, we are currently in the one-to-one kind of physically going out and connecting with folks. So really looking forward to getting those results too. So as a reminder and a closing, we will have our final report and final results to you September of this year, so next month. And we are happy to come back and speak to you all about those results, but really look forward to engaging in some meaningful conversations about what the findings are. And I will turn it back to Chair Zelli to lead us into a Q&A portion.
Well, thank you so much. You've really given us a lot of information, and we also know that it's a work in process for you in engagement, but also really for us as we contemplate all this information and we continue to have conversations about safety and law enforcement and our customer-focused kind of approach. So let's open it up. Anybody have questions or even thoughts? Molly.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this report and to the team for all of this work. This is just super and very informative. Looking forward to the final report in September. My question is, I realize that this focus was on transit users. What is the value and role of those who are not currently using transit? Either they have given it up because they didn't feel safe or for whatever reasons during COVID or whatever, but how do we tap into the voices of those who at one time perhaps used transit, don't anymore for whatever reason, especially as we're trying to build back our ridership numbers?
Great question. Marika, I'm going to turn it to you if that works, because I feel like we've captured some of those folks actually in the survey.
Thank you. Yes. What I would say is that my belief is that, like, with the newsletter and with the different distribution list that goes out to ridership that is current and riding, as well as folks that have been engaged with the system in the past. The other thing that I will say is the outreach was intentional, both at transit platforms, but also through social media. And so our invitation was to people who have been or are transit riders, I think also what you get is from the stakeholder groups, those interviews and questions where they met with systems people that, you know, gave insight to their stakeholders who are or are not showing up again in transit. So your universities, you have your downtown councils and corporations that kind of weighed in those places. So I think there's multiple ways that that showed up. I think that's an ongoing question that needs to be asked. And our survey in itself didn't explicitly say, are you riding right now or were you once a rider? That more so came up in the community forums where they would say that.
Just a quick follow-up. Thank you for that. So you didn't really, there wasn't a way to distinguish who is a transit rider and those who were perhaps responding to the survey or in the focus group or whatever, who were not using transit, and this is why they are not. It's all kind of together. Is that correct?
So what we did to kind of answer that question was the demographics that we would ask people to input. So it would be like, what route do you use so that or what region are you using your transit? Are you currently using transit? So we didn't ask if like, did you use transit 2 years ago? We just said, are you a transit rider currently? What routes, to kind of get more sense of who they were representing.
Okay, thank you.
Any others? Go ahead, Sue Bento.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for this great work on it. I'm wondering if there's still an opportunity to engage with folks in the East Metro area where we have two major BRTs in the development phase, one closer to breaking ground and going forward, the second one a bit behind that. In at least one of them, there's been some real pushback, and a lot of it has to do with perceptions about safety and the need for transit in this area. And to the extent that we might be able to engage folks, I would appreciate it. The second thing that I would like to comment on is I'm interested in where people get their information about transit. I've noted in the East Metro area, we've lost a lot of local newspapers, and I don't know if folks in the East Metro area are still reading the Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune as they once were, or if they're relying on Nextdoor and Facebook and other social media. But I'm wondering, to the extent that news sources influences people's opinions. It may be too late to ask that question, but I think it's an important one for us to know about.
Michelle, do you, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll take that. I'll especially take that last one. I think the question about making sure we're getting to these areas where there are developing corridors is pretty important. Frankly, I think that the opportunity to have those conversations is never over. Just because we've had this safety engagement now, we're certainly intensively talking about some of these things, and there have definitely been participants from that part of the region. But we have, an ongoing conversation about transit and transit development that we have an opportunity to continue talking to those folks about. As it relates to, what their sources of information are, I mean, I think we know that the decline of media has certainly been and had an impact on how people consume information, and that the power of social media has certainly increased. A lot of those opportunities do require partnership with certain organizations, and that's why reaching out to community organizations as the Citizens League and Twin Cities Innovation Alliance did for this work is so critical, because those service organizations and community organizations are really important conduits that carry trust relationships to the people that they're in direct contact with. That's something that we employ on a regular basis in our communications work. So we'll be continuing to do that as we move forward. I think that's an incredibly important point, and we'll definitely be exploring that in the coming months as we continue this conversation.
Anyone else? Well, this is rich information, and we certainly are going to have more opportunities to digest it and to talk about it. So I want to give at least anybody a chance for any other questions or thoughts. All right.
I'm sorry,
You
Mr.
start.
Chair. Sorry about that. I was having problems. Just
Sorry,
briefly, and I
time's up, Robert. No, go
yeah,
ahead.
sorry, I know, cut them off. But I really wanna. I just think this is fascinating. I look forward to seeing the more developed report in a bit. I just really want to thank the team for the level of youth outreach that was done and how specific that was. And I find it really striking, kind of the contrast in the data, but from the youth input to the more broader general public, and I look forward to kind of teasing that out further. But I'm really grateful that you did that level of outreach to youth. I think it's going to be very helpful. Thank you.
Well, I'll second that appreciation, and also just the range of constituencies that wasn't easy to track down. So it was really important input, and I think we're all looking forward to the final report. But it never really is final, because as I think Michelle, you really just pointed it out, particularly when regarding new service, our engagement is going to continue and in deeper ways with many partners, and we really have value having this partnership with all of you. So with that, I think we do have time for a couple of more presentations on. So I want to thank our friends from the Citizens League and Marika to join us here today, and we will, as they say, be in touch. So thanks so much, and we'll be talking soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, council members. Have a good evening.
Good evening. I got it wrong. We were going to try to, if we had to only have one presentation, we were going to jump to land use, but I think we have time for both. If I don't have, if I've got it wrong, for both changes in green spaces with Alan Esch and our land use inventory with Paul Hansen. But let's just jump into following the agenda with changes in green spaces. Ellen, are you ready? And you can jump in.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Right, welcome.
Yeah, so just for a bit of context, I'm a senior data scientist on the research team. And as you all know, I'll be talking about how green space has changed over the last 40 years in our region, and also how green space is really closely connected with land use in order to draw some synergies with the work that my colleague Paul Hansen will be presenting on next. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll just kind of give you an outline of what you'll be able to expect. So next slide, please. So first, I'll give a brief overview on what is green space, why it's important, and how green space intersects with land use. And then I'll provide a bit of context on how our region has changed with respect to these items historically, and also share some information on how green space is changing in more contemporary times. And I'll also discuss how green space intersects with equity considerations and how knowledge about past and present dynamics in green space could help us inform a more sustainable future. Next slide, please. So to start, let me unpack what green space is and how green space differs from land use, as you'll hear about in the next presentation. So green space, as I'm defining it for this presentation, is essentially any area of land that's covered by plants. So importantly, this means that green space can exist within any land use type. On the right of the screen, there's a couple pictures which illustrate what green space can look like. So green space can, of course, encompass natural ecosystems like prairies and forests, but lots of other areas are also covered by plants. For instance, golf courses can be green spaces, as can residential areas or boulevards, which might have tree cover. And within our region, agricultural cropland is also regionally significant. Now, the reason that knowing something about how green space has changed across our region is because plants provide some critical ecosystem services. And so ecosystem services really refers to the benefits that come from nature, which are essential for society. Clean air, clean water, and biodiversity habitat are three big examples of ecosystem services. So plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is important for air quality, as well as regulating the climate. The structure that plants provide with their roots and also above ground tissues can reduce erosion and runoff issues. Their roots are effective sponges for taking up excess nutrients like nitrogen, which can degrade water quality. So clean water is another major ecosystem services that plants can help provide. And biodiversity is also important, not only the diversity of plants themselves, but also various animals and insects and birds that rely on that vegetation. Maintaining biodiversity is, of course, essential for getting clean air and clean water. For instance, different species of plants can have different rooting depths, which can help absorb more nutrients from wastewater. And in the last several years, you might have also seen some headlines that we're in the midst of an insect apocalypse with up to 75% declines in insect populations since the 1970s, which is of course alarming in its own right, but also threatens food security as pollination of many crops is reliant on insects. So biodiversity, understanding why biodiversity is an ecosystem service is also pretty important here. Now, conversely, land use is more focused around human activities rather than plant activities. And the land use inventory for our region, which Paul is going to share the 2020 update with you all, that is going to provide an understanding of how people are using the region's supply of land. And given that the land use inventory is updated every 5 years, we can also begin to understand things like development patterns and land consumption rates. So in summary, green space is about plants and land use is about people, but there are feedbacks between the two in some fairly obvious ways, as well as some other more nuanced ways. So hopefully you'll come away from this presentation with an understanding of why it's important to consider these feedbacks in planning for the future. Next slide, please. So now that you understand a bit about what green space is and why it's important, let's step back and get a bit of perspective on how our region has changed. So at the turn of the last century, the region was primarily dominated by natural ecosystems, like the map on the left shows. The western metro had a lot of hardwood forests with pockets of pine and prairie mixed in, and the central and eastern metro is shown by those orange colors, was dominated by oak savannas and prairies. But over the last 100 years, there's been nearly a complete turnover in vegetation and land use, where our region is now dominated by agricultural systems and the built environment. Now, not only has there been a change in the vegetation type and quantity of natural spaces, but there's also been a change in ecosystem quality and ecosystem function. So ecosystem quality and function are quite hard to measure since fewer long-term data sets exist either regionally or more globally. And I'm not really aware of anything that stretches back prior to the late 60s. However, in the late 60s, the breeding bird survey started, and this is a really widespread scientific effort that counts the number of birds and the number of bird species. And that's like counting birds is actually a pretty good way to measure ecosystem function because birds can integrate multiple ecosystem aspects. So they rely on the habitat provided by green space for their own shelter. So declines in habitat quality and quantity can be reflected in bird populations. Now in the 7-county council region, we're lucky enough to have a route just outside Lakeville, which is pretty representative of patterns seen globally in this broader data set. And so just in our own backyard, the breeding bird survey has documented that we're only seeing half the number of birds, which is the decline shown by that green line, as to what we saw 50 years ago. And we're also seeing reductions in the number of bird species, which is that blue line that you see falling off since the 2010s. So we know that green space really has changed over the long term. Next slide, please. And in more recent years, there's different techniques that we can leverage to understand how land use and green space have changed. Specifically, we can leverage satellite imagery. So in the 80s, our space agency, NASA, they launched some satellites which essentially take pictures of the entire Earth about every 2 weeks. And we can use those pictures to give us some information about what the plants are doing, where they are, how much they're growing. And this is provided by what's called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is widely used. It works really well. You know, countless scientific papers using NDVI and this satellite data. And NDVI is essentially a measure of greenness. Down at the bottom of this slide with the 3 images there, you can see what NDVI looks like when it's mapped. So here I've shown NDVI over a portion of woodberry. Darker green in these images is meaning higher NDVI and more plants, and white areas are meaning quite low NDVI. So that white line that's going across the top of all of those pictures is actually I-94. So looking at the time series here, you can see that in 1985, this region was mostly green. It was actually mostly farmland. But by 2005, much of that region was quite brown, as indicated by that white color, as it was, new development was occurring. But by last year, we actually see that, that portion of woodberry has regained higher NDVI values as compared to what we saw in 2005. And this is just vegetation maturing, revegetation of new developments, things like that. So NDVI is definitely, or greenness and green space is definitely a dynamic process here. And one other, thing to note about this satellite imagery and the approach that we can take to looking at green space changes is these satellite images are processed quite quickly, so real-time measurements of greenness is possible. As always, there's some shortcomings to every method, and one challenge for NDVI and greenness is that it's easy for us to measure vegetation quantity, but getting an indication of vegetation quality is more challenging. Next slide, please. So we can intersect contemporary land use with nearly 40 years of greenness change across the metro to show how the two are connected. And so this is really, priming you for all of the great results that Paul Hansen is going to show. But I've taken that 2020 land use layer and looked at how greenness varies across those land use types throughout the entire region over time. So this is really, using what's on the ground right now and looking backwards, seeing how it's changed. So this figure has time on the x-axis and greenness on the y-axis. And again, just reiterating that a higher NDVI number is meaning more green, while a lower number is meaning less green. There's a point for every year. Points are broken apart by their 2020 land use designation using the color. And looking at this data, just do remember that greenness in 1984, which is the leftmost point, is not necessarily a gold standard of what we should be striving for or anything like that, but it is a useful benchmark to understand how we're doing on the green space front. So a couple key takeaways emerge from this figure, and the first being that there's a huge variation in greenness across land use types. Now, this is not surprising, but it is useful to quantify which land uses are regionally important green spaces. For instance, the top 3 lines there in that figure are agricultural, undeveloped, and parkland, and they have much higher greenness than other land uses on average. So when those 3 land uses develop or change into different land uses, you can expect to see a resulting loss of greenness on average. Now within those three high greenness land types, the greenness of them has remained quite constant and even increased slightly over time. And this is expected because other temperate regions see similar patterns with longer summers associated with climate change increasing NDVI, and also improved agricultural technologies can increase crop yields and have increased crop yields a lot since the 80s. And NDVI picks that up. Now looking at some of these other lines, that pink line in the middle is single family detached residences. And the land that's currently used for single family detached has a very different 40-year trajectory of greenness. So those areas went through a mid-2000s dip in greenness, but greenness has largely recovered since then. So the Woodbury example on the previous slide highlights how maturing vegetation can lead to increases in vegetation. Yet another trend is seen in land that's used for commercial purposes like office, industrial, and retail. And those are those lines at the bottom of this figure. And there we've seen a pretty remarkable decline in greenness with no rebound over the last 40 years. So that's kind of a, highlighting an opportunity, a place that maybe we can do better with some more planful land use policies, something like that. Certainly some room for improvement there, if you will. Now we can further parse the intersection of greenness and land use and show differential patterns in greenness within areas that have newly developed in the past 5 years. And so this will be taking this, or this takes the 2020 land use layer and compares it to the 2016 land use layer, which was the time point previous. And it looks at where like new development has occurred, and we can look at the greenness of those areas as well. So in this plot, I've added larger points that are surrounded by a black border to show these newly developed lands. And I've highlighted just residential lands in particular here. So you can compare them to what the average greenness is for those land use types. So notice how the newly developed areas for single family attached and detached residences really don't deviate that much from the average greenness for those land uses types. And that's shown in the dark green line as well as the pink line, where the large black bordered points fall right on the trend line there. On the other hand, newly developed multifamily and mixed use residential lands do have lower greenness than average for those land use types. And you can see that by those large black bordered dots falling below the trend line for those land use types. Specifically, multifamily, newly developed multifamily has much lower greenness on average than the average multifamily that has existed for longer than 5 years. So what this indicates is that it might be particularly important to consider how new development of multifamily and mixed-use residential can occur without leading to a loss in green space. Next slide, please. Now, to further unpack new development trends, over the past 5 years, we've seen that land consumption is disproportionately occurring on the greenest areas. So most land uses have seen both gains and losses in acreage, which are shown in the green and the blue colors respectively in that plot. But the net trend is that agricultural and undeveloped land has been lost over 5 years. If you'll recall on the previous slide, those land uses tended to be the greenest areas. So it is important to consider how changing land use types can impact green space. Now, what you'll also see in this figure is that there has been a net gain in park and recreational or preserve land, which again is a highlight that Paul can tell you more about later. But that could represent an opportunity to offset some of the losses in green space. Now, looking at the spatial patterns of where exactly gains or losses in green space are occurring could be quite useful here. So next slide, please. So this map just highlights block groups in blue, which have seen declines in greenness between 2015 and 2020. Now, the spatial patterns of this, might be as you'd expect, with some areas where new development is taking place, those areas are losing greenness. But rather than the specific patterns here, an important takeaway is that the satellite-derived information about greenness does provide spatially explicit information. And as the satellites are seeing it, every single meter, every single area of land across the region has a story to tell. And this is just one example of how those stories can be interpreted. Next slide, please. So continuing to think about greenness and the spatially explicit patterns we see, here I've joined the greenness information with census data on population demographics. And you can clearly see that there are racial and economic disparities in green space. So panel A on the left is showing the percent of block group population that's comprised by people of color on the x-axis and how that's related to greenness on the y-axis. You can see that block groups that are majority white have a much higher greenness average than block groups that are majority persons of color. Panel B is showing that block group level income also maps strongly onto patterns of greenness. There's a really steep slope between median household income and greenness up until about $100,000 of annual median income for the block, at which point this relationship is stagnating. Now, this information could be useful in considering how land use planning intersects with equity and how these disparities might be addressed in the future. Next slide, please. Speaking of the future, another capability that we have when leveraging satellite data is to link greenness with carbon sequestration. It's pretty intuitive that the more that plants grow, which is reflected in those higher greenness and higher NDVI values, that means that the plants are taking up more carbon from the atmosphere. Now, under the hood, NDVI needs to interact with some weather patterns and vegetation identity, but essentially it's possible to tell a story about how carbon sequestration rates have changed over the last 40 years. So here I've broken apart communities by their Thrive designation, and you can see that agricultural communities, which often have a lot of agricultural land uses, they have not only the largest carbon pool, but the highest carbon sequestration rates. So on average, plants in agricultural areas are working harder to take up carbon than plants in other areas. And you can see that urban areas are having really low rates of carbon sequestration, which is also mirrored by the land use, the mix of land use that we see in more urban areas. So this underscores the disproportionate role that agricultural communities could play in our region as it relates to sustainability and carbon balance goals as we think towards the future. And coupled with evolving agricultural technologies, agricultural land is recognized globally for the untapped potential it could play in contributing to some natural climate solutions to regulate atmospheric carbon levels. But more broadly, I'd really argue that this final figure makes the case that existing carbon stocks, as well as future carbon sequestration rates, should be considered when guiding land use in order to reach climate goals. And again, more broadly, that knowing something about how land use has changed and continues to change, which is why we do these land use inventories, is really important to understand how that intersects with green space and maybe like how we're making progress towards achieving goals, or how we can better achieve, define our vision for the future. So with that, next slide, please. This does conclude my presentation, and I'd be really happy to hear any comments or questions that you might have about green space and how it intersects with land use and land use change.
Thank you, Ellen. This is fabulous information, and now I get more meaning to what green space really is. And I would want any of my children to grow up to be data scientists. What an incredible, job you have here at the Met Council. Any questions, thoughts from anyone? Go ahead, Peter.
Fascinating information, Ellen. Appreciate it. So we have a greenhouse gas inventory for each community, and it tracks the greenhouse gas emissions and, as you know, all, maybe 5 different sectors or so. And I'm wondering how your information may mesh with the greenhouse gas inventory, if at all.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that, Councilmember Lindstrom. So yeah, I mean, the research team is working together collaboratively on all of this work. And you make a great point that thinking about land use and particularly agriculturally derived emissions is certainly an opportunity to make our greenhouse gas inventory more complete. Like looking towards the future, some scenario planning tools that folks are working on with regards to greenhouse gas emissions does rely really heavily on what land use might look like in the future. And so these connections are, I mean, they're just everywhere, and synergies between all of this is really, dominant. And so, yeah, you make a great point that there are lots of connections here, and hopefully you'll be seeing these threads and these ties to everything.
Mr. Chair, a quick follow-up.
Sure.
I think the other tool we have is the flooding tool, and this is equally as tied into that flooding tool that we have.
Exactly. And the extreme heat tool, plants can cool, like tree canopy can cool a lot of areas. And so, there, one thing that I think that makes green space really useful, or thinking about green space and greenness, one reason that it's really useful is because it integrates a lot of that information, right? And it does so in a real time way where we can track changes from year to year, as well as thinking about, okay, well, what's happened in aggregate over 40 years. So I think it's a really powerful tool that we have access to here, and thinking about, ways to connect all of these threads and ways to maybe be a bit creative in thinking how green space can help inform the trajectory that we want to see.
I've been particularly interested in these ideas of urban canopies, and they would show up on the satellite data. I mean, would that move the NDVI? It's not just large swaths of land space. It could be just boulevards and residential areas, and also not are disproportionate with incomes as well.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Chair Zelli. And indeed, we see that instead of showing, like if you can recall how equity and green space are connected, I don't have to show greenness there. I can show tree canopy, and you see the same, if not stronger, relationships there. And I'm working with some colleagues as well to think about how greenness and can be useful in determining like which areas could be prioritized for growing the tree canopy, right? How do we identify some of these levers that are actionable and that are backed up by data in order to, reduce some of these climate effects?
Right. Any other quick questions? I want to leave time for Paul, but go ahead. Oh, I thought we had some question. Well, we can get back to it. Don't go anywhere, Ellen. We'll continue this conversation, and I know we want to hear about the land use inventory. So, Paul Hanson, Paul, why don't you give your presentation while and we'll have time for more conversation after that.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Thank you, Chair. You able to hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Loud and clear. Perfect.
Very good.
Right.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and council members, for having me. I appreciate being here. And thank you, Ellen, for your great presentation. Most of what I'm going to be covering is kind of the land consumption. And I think Ellen kind of gave you the so what to the picture. So keep in mind what she presented as I go through some of this information about the land use inventory. Next slide, please. So just real briefly about the land use inventory. This is something the council has been involved in since the 70s, but we generally do it about every 5 years, give or take a couple years. It's particularly important that we try to do it in line with the decennial census. We can then have a good understanding of the spatial distribution of the region on top of the demographic information that we gain from the census. The land use inventory is based off of aerial imagery. The imagery we have flown in partnership with our other regional partners and state agencies. We also utilize county and local assessor information that is available to us to help identify different types of land uses. We also take advantage of our Met Council's building permit survey, and we also use the internet. It's a very useful tool. When we can't quite tell what it should be, we can go out there and get a frontline view of it. So the land use inventory, keep in mind, is existing land use, meaning what is observed on the ground. It's not necessarily a tax classification. In other words, what sort of tax can be levied on the land, or what communities are guiding. It's not even land cover, which is kind of what Ellen was talking about in terms of vegetation or maybe wetland coverage. It is what we are able to discern how the land is being used through the imagery and other information. We take those views and we interpret it and classify it using a generalized and uniform classification scheme. Currently, it's 21 different categories. And these categories have not changed since 2000, so this gives us a great trending opportunity to look at development over a couple decades. Once we've completed the initial collection, we do invite communities to review the information that we've captured for their community and provide suggestions on changes. They are on the ground, they know their communities better than we do, and we often get very good feedback from them. And then just lastly, keep in mind this is a snapshot in time. It is representative of April 2020. We do not update this information as we move forward, other than doing it every 5 years when we do this inventory. Next slide, please. So why do we undertake land use inventory? Well, in conjunction with the multiple years that we do it, it does give us a good idea of land consumption trends and development across the region. It assists us in our forecasting and land supply analysis. It helps other regional planning in the region in terms of transportation planning or being able to identify maybe affordable housing needs, things like that. It's major input into some of our climate work, understanding the types of uses and what sort of impact they may have on greenhouse gas or maybe the greenness of the region, as Ellen just went over. It also is an input into our groundwater and surface water modeling. We need to know where the demand is, what type of demand, and can we meet that growing need as we move forward in the future for such. And then, of course, many communities end up using our land use instead of undertaking their own inventory. Next slide, please. So a little teaser just of what these findings I'm going to be talking about. In general, we are seeing increase in land consumption for the first time since 2005. I think a lot of that has had to deal with the housing crisis and the recession of the early 2010s. As usual, single-family detached is the main land consumer of the region. Talk about that a little bit more. Shifts in non-residential seem to reflect also that economic sequence that happened, and also seem to reflect some shared values that we have and what we feel is important as a community and the things that we are choosing to invest in. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. As the region grows, so do our parks, and we all love our parks, so that's always a good thing. And then lastly, one of the things that we've noticed is over the last decade that we're demanding less land. So the amount of land that we need to accommodate the same amount of growth in population and households has had a dramatic decrease in the last decade. We'll show you more about that in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. So just a quick snapshot of the region. We are 1.9 million acres. When we look at how that is split up into different land use, and these are very general. We have, like I said, 21 different categories. So I've kind of lumped these together. But when we look at it, in our region, about 30% is agriculture. Still tillable or is being tilled, or pasture land, or maybe nursery or other sorts of horticulture. 22% is what we call undeveloped. So this could be vacant land, or a vacant lot, I should say, or it could be fallow fields, woodlots, anything that we aren't able to really discern how the land is being used. And so together, the agriculture and the undeveloped make up over 50% of our region. And this is generally the area where new development or land is consumed. Once it's developed, then we're talking about redevelopment. So a lot of what I'm going into is about land consumption. So we're talking about these areas of undeveloped and ag. And as Ellen had been talking about in terms of greenness, this has a significant impact on the greenness. And there is this sequence of development where we do kind of start out as being cultivated land or this open land, and then we develop it. And then as things mature and grow, we not only get the greenness, but we also get the opportunity for the redevelopment throughout the region. When we look at the developed region, or the developed portion of the region, by and far, residential is the #1 consumer at about 25%. Each square on this matrix is about 2% of the region. Other developed land uses such as commercial, industrial, institutional make up about 6% of the region. Parks, rec, and reserve land, 10%. Water, 6%, and transportation being airport, major highways, major freeways is about 2%. This does not include the road rights of ways in our residential neighborhood. So just these major highways. Next slide, please. So when we think about land consumption, as I said, it's been maybe largely stable. It's kind of a question mark there. We have seen a gradual decrease in the amount of land we've consumed over the last 4 land use inventories. This graphic represents the amount of land. So in between 2000 and 2005, about 27,000 acres were consumed. That's roughly the size of Minneapolis. But as we go through time, in the last 4 years, we consumed about 18,000 acres, roughly the size of Minnetonka. But if you look at the numbers in the blue and look at what that growth or consumption has been annually, you can see there has been an uptick since 2016. Is this an ongoing trend or just a correction over the economic periods of the early 2000s? Hard to say at this point. We'll have to kind of keep an eye on that. Next slide, please. So looking at the major player being residential and specifically single family detached, the graph on the left is looking at total developed acres in the region and what proportion of that is made up of single family detached. And you can see it constitutes nearly 2/3 of all developed land in the region. Other residential being multifamily, single family attached, or mixed use residential make up about another 10%. And all other things, commercial, industrial, and such, is only about 25%. When we look at the change just in the last 4 years, we see a similar pattern in terms of single family detached. And the one thing of note that we are seeing, which is very interesting, is of the non-residential, the other single family detached, nearly 7% of the development in the last 4 years has been solely for solar farms out in the rural. That's a significant amount, and something we have not seen in the past. And I imagine that this will be a growing trend as we are committed to looking at alternative energy use or reducing greenhouse gases. I would imagine that that amount of land will continue to grow certain inventory years. Next slide, please. So since single family detached is the big one, where is it happening? Well, this is just representing the amount of acreage being developed by community designation throughout the region. And no real surprise here. It's most of the single family detached is being developed in the suburban edge and emergent suburban edge. This is where the undeveloped and the agricultural land is available and where communities are planning for this growth. The other thing I just wanted to point out is there does seem to be a considerable amount of growth in the rural areas and agricultural areas if you were to add that up. But keep in mind, although the acreage is there, keep in mind that these RIVE designation areas are much larger in area as a percentage. It's a much smaller percent, I think less than 1% of the total land in those community development or community designation areas is being changed into single family detached. Next slide, please. When we look at the other residential, being the other end of the extreme, multifamily and also mixed use residential, you can see, of course, the patterns not only different, but we're actually seeing a fairly, I would say, fairly even distribution across the developed communities or developed community designations. However, as you can see, the suburban actually has more multifamily community designations. And, you know, I think this is a reflectance of the need for what communities are seeing in the need of having more housing choice in their communities, whether that's based on economic need or whether it's on life cycle housing. They are finding the need and moving forward with it and providing opportunities. Next slide, please. The other aspect of housing, an important aspect, is affordability. And just looking at the affordability of multifamily developments, when we look at the chart, it's the same acreage as the last chart, but we're seeing in the lighter blue the proportion that's affordable. And there's a fairly good representation across the whole spectrum region. This seems to be a good sign. I think it seems to represent that, once again, communities and developers are understanding this need and are embracing it. I will just point out that this is acreage development. It is not units, so it could have a slightly different picture if you were looking at total units, but it's still a promising sign, I feel, in terms of the development. I did not expect to see so much in the suburban edge. Next slide, please. So going away from residential and thinking about the non-res, this is the commercial, office, institution, industrial, things like that. There's a few stories here. And just to kind of start with, the big one is that commercial, office, institutional. You can see the dramatic decrease since 2000, the amount of land that's been developed, and a fairly stagnant growth in the last 4 years. Here again, this is probably a reflecting the economic conditions that we just kind of went through in the previous decade. And the relative flat growth of the last 4 years may be just kind of a representing that we had an adequate supply that was already out there. But I think it also has to do with the second story, which is that next grouping, which is the non-res mixed use. We see a dramatic increase in that. And when we looked at kind of the land use itself, we are seeing a trend in the repurposing of industrial or business parks or this flex industry to accommodate more commercial, office, and institution, whether it be a charter school or a health clinic or some sort of recreational facility. More and more, we're seeing the growth in those industries in these flex industrial rather than building new. It seems somewhat a good way to go about it economically for the businesses. And then the third thing is the kind of growth in industry here. And it seems like a little bit of well, opposite of what you'd expect if we're talking about the conversion of industrial to mixed use residential. But when we break down and look at that, what the makeup of is the industrial, and if we think back to the earlier slide, nearly 3/4 of the new industrial has been developed, and this is talking about, once again, land consumption, so new consumption, is those solar farms in those rural areas. So this is a very significant trend that we're seeing. Maybe not trend, but hopefully a new trend that we'll be seeing in the future, and how land is being. Next slide, please. So getting away from the more developed things, we're going to what we tend to love in the region is our parks. We do continue to see an increase in land developed into the parks, and this is not just regional parks. This is all parks, community parks, recreational, including golf course, and just preserved open space. And in general, we gained over 10,000 acres in the last 4 years in Park and Rec. But in fact, it's actually been a little bit more than that, because what is a little hard to see here is we're seeing a trend in the closures of golf courses. And maybe many of you have know about this and experienced it in your communities. We lost nearly 1,000 acres of golf course in the last 4 years. That's on top of 7,000, or not 7,000, sorry, 500 acres the 6 years before that. So, why are these golf courses closing? Well, I can't say for sure, but I think it's probably happening in a lot of these communities where their land availability for new development is drying up. They're fully developed, and landowners and community leaders are reevaluating how they're using the land. What we are seeing in these golf courses is predominantly it is being developed as residential and also as recreational park and open space in these areas. Together, I think about the development of the urbanized area or the developed land uses, and also the expansion of park, and it seems like they're kind of opposite ends of what we would want as a community. But in fact, they kind of seem to go together. And slide, please. Next slide, please. So when we look at the single family detached acreage and where it's happening across the region, and also where the Park and Rec is being developed, you can see they are almost going hand in hand throughout the region. And if you think about it, this does kind of make a lot of sense. It's not that odd. As we develop new neighborhoods, we're putting in new community parks for the kids to play in. As we develop new economic centers, we're adding new recreational facilities, whether that's tennis courts or just park plazas. As we develop new commercial land or industrial complexes, we're adding new preserve land in the form of stormwater retention basins and et cetera. So overall, we have to have, well, do we have to? Maybe that's a strong word. But, as we see development happen across the region, we are also seeing parks being also included in that growth. And that's always a good thing that we think about in our region. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean for land consumption overall? As I hinted at the beginning, when we look at the land consumed per 1,000 residents or 1,000 households over the last 3 decades, we can see that the amount of land, and this once again is newly consumed land that was either ag or undeveloped, is about half the amount of land that we've needed over the previous 2 decades. This is significant. It tends to seem to reflect changes in what both the communities and neighbors want, or the type of neighborhoods residents want. It also seems to reflect policies that seem to encourage higher density development, and with the idea that they're going to help support various infrastructure, whether it's be transportation or environmental services, sewer systems, things like that. So I would imagine that this trend will continue as we move forward and we think about greenhouse gas and how to reduce that, and try to build equitable sort of communities and neighborhoods and bringing things together rather than spreading them out. So this is a pleasant thing to see. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate the takeaways here, single family detached is still kind of the big driver, and look at non-residential. We are seeing the economic impact on those things, but we're also seeing a change based on how people are thinking about the land and how they think about using it in terms of the mixed use areas, and also with the development of the solar farms. And as we go forward with more of our solar initiatives, I would imagine we'll have to start thinking about how to think about land use in that way as we start to develop solar canopies and maybe water retention canopies and things like that through our region. As the region grows, so do our parks, which is always a good thing. And once again, we're seeing an increase, back to the first bullet, we're seeing an increase in the growth of the region, but we are seeing less land needed than we have in the past. And I think that just reflects how we're being more efficient in how we think about the land. Next slide, please. So just to kind of leave you with this, what does all this mean in terms of land use and how we think about the regional development and what you're going to be faced with going forward with the 2050 plan? Obviously, Ellen gave you a lot of great fodder to think about in terms of greenness and thinking about how we can incorporate that into the way we think about developing our region. And I just would reiterate that, when we think about consuming land, we are thinking about that there are changes in the demand and the type of housing and the type of community that people want. And it's also reflected in our shared policies and our goals, both at the local level and the community, or at the comprehensive plan level, or in our regional policies in the regional development framework. Our region continues to grow and change. New population and economic growth will impact future land use consumption and development. Oops, sorry. And yeah, as we grow, we also need to think about evolving our shared visions for the future and setting policies to fall in line with those visions, and making sure we're being inclusive and bringing ideas to the table for everyone. But of course, I'm just the mapper. I'm just the map guy. You guys are the policymakers. So this will be something that you will lead in the future. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. Any questions?
Paul, that was really great and also really rich material. And yes, you're just a simple country mapper, but you had really great information and really great to fit these themes. Can I just jump in? And I know we're at time. We're just going to ask to stay over just a little bit in order to have some questions for you. More density, more compactness. Can we assume, lower carbon footprint, more affordable? I mean, is that are these trends a good thing in terms of our regional planning?
Well, I think they certainly are. I think there's a lot more research we need to do and to investigate. Like I said, a lot of this is based on acreage and not necessarily units. And of course, that has a big impact where things are happening. But I think it's a good sign. We're heading in the right direction.
Great. Anybody have questions, thoughts for Paul? Well, we've answered everything. Well,
I guess so.
I think that it's safe to say we're going to want to continue as we think about that 2050 plan, this land use report, and Ellen, your information on the green green spaces is really helpful for all of us to be thinking about for the areas we are obviously greatly concerned. Housing affordability, I mentioned climate, but certainly, as a master planning agency, these are really interesting trends. Okay, I'll give anybody another chance. I know I nearly cut off Robert last time, so I hate to do that. So anybody else have a thought? Deb, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. I always love this presentation because I think it provides such great information of how we're seeing growth. I will say, representing areas that have suburban edge and emerging suburban communities, we're definitely seeing higher density housing, a lot of those things that maybe we weren't seeing a few years ago when we last saw this. So I think that, the data that you're presenting is really reflective of what I'm seeing in my own town, in my district. I think it's also good to highlight so often something that sometimes we can easily overlook, but the importance of green space and agricultural lands to our region and how important it is. It's the largest amount of land in the region, so I think it's really important to keep that on the roadmap. And as we look at developing policies, even for some of our rural centers, so cities like Waconia and Belle Plaine, that really are the supply areas, not necessarily a part of the urban area, but are so critical and important for those agricultural and rural areas. And so I think that just all of this information really helps to highlight that, and just to help remind us that when we're thinking of developing policies, they have to work in Minneapolis, but they also have to work in places like Waconia and Belle Plaine and places like that. So thank you very much. It's great information.
Welcome. Feel free to reach out to me if any of you or any of your fellow council members have any questions on it. I'll do my best to answer them.
Really appreciate that invitation and your presentation, Paul. All right, with that, I think this is it's summertime, and so we've all been busy, but I really appreciate these presentations. A lot of information on a Wednesday in August. We'll have a council meeting next week. Hope everybody stays cool, and appreciate seeing all of you. And this committee of the whole is adjourned. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Great meeting.